sanitary and moral concerns about the mixing of Mexican American children and Anglo students who might be negatively influenced by the presence of Mexican students in the main school. The judge presiding over this case ruled that children of Mexican origin couldn't be segregated in these schools because they were of, quote, the Caucasian race. The year is 1930, and it's a quaint suburban town of Lemon Grove, California, nestled among, as you can guess, lemon groves and orange trees. And the prosperity in this town is palpable. This is not a poor town, and it's a testament to the American dream. An excellent women's club, a fine golf course, and a well-equipped school. These are all direct descriptions of Lemon Grove at the time. But as the school board's actions unfurled, Lemon Grove found itself in the national spotlight, not for its prosperity, but for its racially charged school policy. A reality where there are, quote, sanitary and moral concerns about the mixing of Mexican American children and Anglo students. Now, this court case is so different than all of the other court cases we've looked at in this realm of becoming white to get citizenship here in the United States. First of all, this is not a Supreme Court case. Secondly, plaintiff was not trying to become white. What the judge says at the end of this court case really takes us in a totally different direction. So the school board for this Lemon Grove school said they were afraid of overcrowding and contamination of their Anglo students. And so they designated a separate space for the Mexican American students. They did this without informing the parents of the kids. 95% of these children were American-born kids. They were American citizens of Mexican ancestry. Let's go back a little bit. One day, you wake up to discover that your home has been invaded and seized. From the lush landscapes of California to the arid expanses of Arizona and New Mexico, the 1846 war, led by President Polk, turned familiar territories into foreign lands for the Mexican people. But here comes the twist. You have these folks who are living on land that was once Mexico, land that became American soil through conquest. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to guarantee citizenship for these people if they so chose. But many Mexican Americans found themselves not just second-class citizens, but citizens now of a completely reshaped reality. A lot of these people were technically citizens of the United States, but they didn't have the protection that the other citizens of the United States had. So the most prevalent and persistent form of discrimination during this era for Mexican Americans was manifested in this creation of these Americanization schools. And if you know anything about Native American history, you know about the Indian boarding schools. This is not quite to that level, but the term was coined to denote institutions that were designed to Americanize incoming immigrants. The United States experienced a surge in the immigrant population at the turn of the century until the 1930s, which we've talked about a lot on this channel. That's kind of when immigration was kind of got put to a halt for a while. Well, this prompted a reactionary wave of these Americanization projects, if you will. This trend of setting up Americanization schools had been growing across the Southwest United States since the Depression. And I think the term Americanization kind of falsely suggests this like noble intention to support immigrants. But in reality, I think it was really a form of thinly veiled segregation. And when we're talking about segregation, you know, we've talked about the Jim Crow laws, where you have very blatant and overt segregation, white versus colored. This is a different flavor of the same thing. But according to the California law in 1931, it was permissible to discriminate against Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, but it wasn't permissible to discriminate against Hispanic Americans. Now, we're not going to go down this route, but I just want to touch on this. For the most part, most of the time, a Hispanic American is going to have predominant Native American ancestry. We'll come back to that at the end of this video. However, the Bliss Bill was navigating the state legislature at this time, and it intended to include Hispanics in the groups that could legally face discrimination. So at this point, there was this movement to say we really need to make a harder stance for segregating these people from white people. But let's go back to the Lemon Grove. So the Lemon Grove School building was brimming with 165 students from 1st grade to 8th grade. So these are little kids. And they also had 2 external latrines outside, which was common for the time. Remember, this is the 1930s. Well, with the lack of funds to expand the current school or introduce indoor plumbing, the board began to explore alternative solutions. So they had too many kids in this school. They didn't have indoor plumbing yet. They're trying to figure out, oh, what do we do? What do we do? So this led to the idea to establish an Americanization school for approximately 75 Hispanic students, which made them it's like half the student body. And so some of these students had recently arrived from Mexico, but most were born in the US. Their families resided in what was considered the old neighborhood along Olive Street. And these families were self-sufficient. They constructed their own homes, they had kitchen gardens, they produced their own clothing, they went to the local Catholic church. These were generally just like families that kept to themselves. They were good neighbors. But what happened to these kids created a domino effect. So Andy Anderson and his school board neglected to consult state law, and so they clumsily proceeded in the summer of 1930 with plans for a separate school building to house the 75 Hispanic students. A lot of times the school boards in California in particular there was more cases like this, that they felt like educating these Mexican American kids was a waste of taxpayer money because they believed that these kids would just end up being manual labor in the citrus orchards, and they didn't really need an education. And so why waste our time and money on these kids was a mindset that a lot of them had. Old-fashioned segregation was at the core of this plan. This new school where students were to be separated was actually an old 2-room building. It came to be known within the local Mexican American community as La Caballeriza, or the barn. Unlike other segregated schools throughout the Southwest, the Lemon Grove School faced immediate, intense legal opposition from the Hispanic parents. So when the students returned from Christmas vacation on January 5th, 1931, only a small number of the kids actually reported to campus. The apprehensive principal, Jerome Green, who had previously tried to dissuade the school board, was aware that the school board's decision was ultimately backed by the PTA and the local Chamber of Commerce, who held negative stereotypes of the Hispanics in the neighborhood. So the parents decided to stage a strike, which was covered by San Diego Union every single day with headlines like Day 15 of the Lemon Grove school strike. But the parents, while they were striking, they were calm, they were respectful, they were thoughtful, and they were politically astute. They formed a committee named Los Vecinos, or the neighbors, and they organized barbecues and garage sales to raise funds to hire a lawyer. However, a man named Fred Noon decided to take the case pro bono because he realized this was an easy win. And so he thought, like, I'm going to take this case for you guys for free. So the legal action had to be registered under someone's name. So they decided to register the legal proceedings under a little boy from the school. His name was Roberto Alvarez Jr. And he was considered just a standout student, demonstrated excellent English proficiency. And at the time that the case was presented, Roberto was only 10 years old. Interestingly enough, one of Roberto's classmates remarked later on, there was a little documentary made about this, and he said Roberto was chosen as the representative, not just because he could speak English really well, but because he was really handsome. However, parents viewed the creation of the segregated facility like it's not just like the kids are being moved into different classes based on their ability, but it's like you're being moved into a whole new building based on your ethnicity, not your proficiency. And they really felt like this was a threat to the Mexican American community. But the Board of Trustees did not take this lying down. So they had to respond. The school board had to respond, and the Board of Trustees to the school had to respond. And they dismissed all the accusations of segregation or isolating pupils of Mexican lineage. And their rebuttal was crafted in this cocoon of rationality, justifying their actions under this guise of bettering the education for Mexican children. So they're saying, oh, no, you've got this totally wrong. This isn't about racism or segregation. We're actually doing this to help them. This is in their best interests. And so they claimed that it was designed to correct the perceived deficiencies in these Mexican American children and to prevent any potential deterioration in the education of the American students who might be negatively influenced by the presence of Mexican students in the main school. Now remember, 90% of the kids were just of Mexican ancestry. They weren't from Mexico. They were also American. Defendants also argued that the Mexican students' language, which most of their first language was Spanish, was a tremendous handicap. And a segregated school for Mexican children would protect them from the unnecessary competition with white children, thereby mitigating feelings of inferiority. Let me rephrase that. We don't want the kids of Hispanic ancestry competing with the Anglo kids because they're not going to do as well, and we don't want them to feel bad. So we're gonna separate the kids. And the fundamental purpose behind the construction of the new school was to establish an Americanization school. And at these schools, one of the quotes they said was a place where children who were deemed, quote, backward and deficient could receive superior instruction compared to what they would receive in a larger, more diverse school. And so they didn't believe that this was a punishment for the Mexican American kids, but it was a means to enhance their educational experience. So these arguments formed the foundation of the school board's defense when the case went to court. And the hearing was presided over by a well-respected figure in San Diego's judicial circles. It was Judge Claude Chambers. The final word from Judge Chambers was a really potent statement against segregation. And he acknowledged that even though some children do need specialized instruction, like every child needs specialized instruction in something, right? It didn't justify segregating the students into a separate group based on their ethnicity. And he said this was a violation of the laws of California. And so the judge said, quote, to separate all the Mexicans into one group can only be done by infringing in the laws of the state of California. Basically saying separate but equal is not equal. So basically the judgment favored the Mexican American community, but there's more to this because it was the beginning of this case was just about the segregation between the Mexican American and Anglo American kids. But the judge took it to a completely different place. The judge presiding over this case ruled that children of Mexican origin couldn't be segregated in these schools because they were of, quote, the Caucasian race. So, we've been looking at this lens through, the Jim Crow South of these segregated schools between, white and black. But here the judge is saying, well, Mexican Americans, Hispanic Americans, Latinos are Caucasian, so they can't be segregated against. That's the reason why this is not okay. There were existing laws, though, that did allow for the segregation of Oriental, Negro, and Indian children. And that didn't apply here. But I think a really interesting one to me is the lack of consistency in the way Mexican ancestry is handled in the United States. Most folks of Mexican lineage, Mexican heritage, have pretty significant Native American ancestry. The outcome for the Mexican Americans is this de facto stamp of approval of being Caucasian or, belonging to that group. But like some of the other court cases we've looked into, Caucasian doesn't really mean white, although sometimes it means white, and it just depends on who's using it and how. This was the first successful school desegregation court case in the nation, but it only applied to Lemon Grove. It created this framework of testing out legal arguments and evidence against the segregation of public schools. That stuff doesn't just happen overnight. When we think about the desegregation of schools in the United States, of course, we go to the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. But that doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? If you'd like to watch any more videos about the Hispanic American experience, I'll leave them here. And if you're interested in any other videos about how different groups went through the process of trying to become legally white in the United States, I'll leave that here.